So I'm going to make a confession. I teach graduate public finance here at Stanford, and in a public finance class, we cover tax policy. Even I think that tax policy can sometimes be a little bland. But with the debate on the California wealth tax heating up, I think we have something pretty spicy on the menu to discuss. And we have the perfect panel. So I'm going to introduce the moderator. Richard Rubin is the Wall Street Journal's U.S. tax policy reporter. He's been covering tax policy for decades, and he is widely viewed as the best in the business, the most respected in the business. So thank you for flying out to moderate this session. I will let you tee it up and introduce the panelists.
Great, thank you, Neil. It's a pleasure to be here. I actually don't think tax policy is bland, so I'm going to dispute that to start. We've got a great session. I heard the provost of Stanford and the chancellor of Berkeley say just an hour ago that they are trying to encourage debates among opposing views and conversation, and so we've got that right here from those two same universities. We're going to discuss the California wealth tax. Let me describe the proposal real quickly for those of you who haven't heard about it. There's a proposal that is they're gathering signatures. If you haven't heard about it, they're gathering signatures to put on the ballot this November that would impose a one-time wealth tax of up to 5%, basically on billionaires who are resident in California as of January 1st, 2026, based on their wealth as of December 31st, 2026. They're trying to get this on the ballot for November. The tax would be 5% and then payable with an interest charge over 5 years. And I'll let our panelists talk about the pros and cons of that. We have, joining me is Josh Rauh from here at Stanford. He's the George B. Schultz Senior Fellow in Economics at the Hoover Institution, and he's also a finance professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. He's also a former White House official who studies taxes and pensions. And then over here we have Emmanuel Saez from Berkeley, who's a professor of economics and director of the Stone Center on Wealth and Income Inequality. He also studies taxation and inequality. He's a former recipient of the John Bates Clark Medal. So he's gonna, as the visiting team, I guess, he's gonna bat first. And so I will let you get started.
Thank you, Rich. It's a pleasure to be here today in the heart of Silicon Valley, the place in the world that has produced the largest number of billionaires, to argue why it is a good idea to impose a tax on billionaires. So let me give you the background. So the federal government cut drastically, the funding for the Medicaid program that provides health care to low-income Americans. It covers about 30% of Californians, and it was the cornerstone that allowed the United States to reduce dramatically its rate of uninsured. It went down from 20% before Obamacare to 6% now in California. With that cut, that movement towards covering everybody is threatened. So when the federal government retreats, then it's a decision for the states. Are we going to do something, do it ourselves, basically by funding what's no longer funded, and we have to raise taxes. Now, raising taxes at the state level is very difficult. It requires a supermajority. The state, even with its democratic supermajority, has not really done it over the last 15 years. So it falls upon those ballot initiatives to fill the gap. So why is this initiative targeting billionaires? Basically, because they are the group that has done the best in recent years, but also over recent decades. And second, because the taxes they currently pay relative to their wealth and their wealth gains are modest. So in terms of fairness, there is room for increasing their taxes. So The billionaires have done extremely well, fueled by the AI boom. It's been extraordinary in the last 3 years. Today's California billionaire wealth is 2 trillion, and it's grown 140% over the last 3 years. So it's a dramatic increase, so big that now there is so much wealth there in the billionaire class that even what we call, a relatively modest tax can raise substantial revenue. 5% of 2 trillion is 100 billion, and that more or less covers the reduction in funding, that's going to come from the federal government over the next 10 years. But it's not just, the last 3 years. If you look at the broader pictures, the last 45 years where we have the Forbes data, billionaire wealth for Californian billionaires, or the billionaire class, the fraction, the very top fraction of the richest California residents, has grown on average 8%, 8.5% exactly, per year in real terms, while average family incomes have grown, 1.5%. So it's a 7 points differential. When you accumulate it over 45 years, what that means is that average family income, standard of living, have doubled over the last 40 plus years. For the wealth at the very top, it's grown, by a factor 36. Okay, so, and that 7 point differential is good to have in mind, because a 1% tax per year, over 5 years is small relative to those enormous wealth gains. Now, they are small relative to their wealth gains, but it is very big relative to the taxes billionaires currently pay. We estimate, matching data of billionaires, to tax records, that in recent years, billionaires, if you include all the taxes at all the levels, the corporate taxes they pay on their business profits, the federal individual tax, the state tax, and so on, they pay slightly more than 1% of their wealth per year in taxes. So adding this billionaire tax, you can see it's a very big increase. It's almost doubling what we are asking them to pay in total. Okay, and so that's why it's hit a nerve. It's big relative to what they pay. It's small relative to the gains they've been making. Now, we'll spiritedly, debate it with Josh, what are the economic consequences? But let me say a couple words. The reason why we did it one time, 5% payable over 5 years instead of 1% forever, it's because it's a first experiment. There have never been, taxes like this, that target the ultra-rich with such a comprehensive base. So you have to see how the tax is going to work. We set the date, of residency January 1st so that the tax would be very difficult to avoid. Indeed, if the California tax administration is really good at one thing, it's making it hard for you, to leave the state. So that they can collect their income tax. So we think, even though you hear in the press that a lot of those billionaires say they are moving or planning to move, in reality, whether they successfully, have changed residence is another story. And we think, unless they really prepared their move, that's very unlikely to have happened. Now, it's one time 5% also because those who, if you do it, 1% tax permanently, then you can have more mobility as people have time, over years to move. And we felt it was important, given this enormous accumulation of wealth, to make sure, the billionaires who've made their fortunes, thanks to their talent, but also the extraordinary environment they've had in these states, even if they leave, pay at least a contribution, that's commensurate with the enormous fortune they've made. So that's why we are asking 5%. The last thing I will say, because I know this has created a lot of anxiety in Silicon Valley. It's a technical issue about how much you have to pay, if you have shares that have higher voting power in your business. We think that's a non-issue because the reality is that nobody will be asked to pay more than 5%, because if you think that what the default formula gives you in terms of what your wealth is, there is a default formula, to help with administration is too high. You go instead, to the appraisal method that's going to value, the appraised value, of your business. So in no case, anybody will be asked to pay more than 5%. Let me finish by saying, 5% is small relative to the wealth gains, but it is big relative to taxes they pay, and that's why this tax has really hit a nerve. Thank you.
All right, Josh, I know you agree with all of that, so why don't you chime in?
Well, thanks very much, Richard. Thanks, Emmanuel. Well, this proposal is sophisticated. Emmanuel designed it with the intent of basically circumventing all of the classic problems with the wealth tax. We all know Emmanuel is a brilliant economic theorist, and in theory, he thought of everything. In reality, though, the proposal has not survived first contact with actual billionaires. I'm going to make 3 points. First of all, the revenue estimates that the proponents of this Billionaire Tax Act have put forward have already basically been proven to be far too optimistic based on actions that targeted individuals have already taken. Secondly, addressing inequality. This act is very unlikely to have a positive impact on inequality. In fact, what it's likely to do is cause fairly large economic damages that may even make inequality worse. And thirdly, if the state of California has a fiscal emergency, it's a spending problem, not a revenue problem, and it has little or nothing to do with OB3 or the House reconciliation bill that passed last year. So let me proceed to make those points. So on revenues, so Emmanuel and his team started out, as he explained, with 5% of the Forbes billionaires, the California Forbes billionaires, starting with a wealth base that would generate taxes of $109 billion. He then reduced those by 10%, which is a fairly small response parameter, but on the grounds that the various mechanisms that he had built in to the proposal would prevent too much leaving or avoidance or evasion. Okay, so our team went through all of the billionaires person by person, and we discovered some interesting things. So first of all, Larry Ellison is included in their original list. I mean, it was headline news that Larry Ellison left California in 2020, he moved to Hawaii, he's now living in Florida now. I imagine Emmanuel's going to say, no, we have some reason to claim that he's still a California resident. I think that's going to be very difficult. That alone reduces the $100 billion down by $12 billion. Okay, so that alone is just a very big, that's a very big hit. We then, going through all the California billionaires, we found that 6 of the billionaires, including the top 2, Brin and Page, left California between the time that this proposal was announced and December 31st, 2025. So now we can discuss whether that means that they're going to be out of Emmanuel's dragnet. But the fact is that if you put them together with Ellison, best case scenario, now we're down to around $67 billion. So we'd be down almost 40% on the wealth tax base, not 10%. And those are only the people who made the headlines. So, we did some calculations, and under our calculations, we think that probably there's going to be about 40 billion left after others who may have left are accounted for. Okay, but there's another problem, which is the California billionaires, while they may not pay as much tax as Emmanuel would like, they do pay, under our calculations, $3 to $6 billion per year in income taxes. And so if you account for those and you take a net present value of that stream of taxes, of income taxes over time, we find that wipes out all the gains from the wealth tax. Okay, and actually our central estimate score is a negative net present value of $25 billion, as we think that this measure would cost the state $25 billion. Now, to be clear, right, that this does assume that Ellison, Page, and Brin actually did manage to leave in time. They represent about half of the entire wealth base of this tax. And the plan, Emmanuel's plan, is sort of a bet that those named individuals, plus Zuckerberg, who left a little late, right? He left in February 2026, but that those people didn't get out on time. And they're relying on kind of two main arguments. One is in the proposal, a retroactive residency clause. We told Rich we wouldn't be spending time on legal matters. I'm not a legal scholar, but I do think, just as I think about how to score this, I mean, this residency clause will be contested by the courts, right? It's not just going to be the case that this retroactive residency clause is going to for sure guarantee that these individuals somehow didn't manage to leave on time. And the second thing is he's looking to FTB rules, rules by the Franchise Tax Board that hopes might invalidate the 2025 moves because they didn't fully get out in time. If you don't change your doctor, you don't change all your clubs over to Texas or Florida. If your pets are still in California, you can still be caught and taxed. So but let me be clear, right? If California maybe California will ultimately prevail in court. If so, it will have litigated this for years. And it will have permanently imposed real costs on employment, investment, innovation, and there's not going to be any clawing back of that. Second points, which I'll run through more quickly. Okay, so inequality, I think, having read Emmanuel's work over many years, I think Emmanuel is motivated to reduce the problems of inequality and wealth concentration in the United States. But perhaps some of you are thinking after I went through revenue estimates, I mean, okay, well, who cares if it doesn't raise revenue? I mean, if it's solving inequality, then maybe that in and of itself is a benefit and is good enough. If inequality is an economic bad, then we should actually be willing to pay something to reduce it. But I think the challenge here is that when imposing a wealth tax at the state level, if the wealthiest leave, you haven't really reduced inequality, you basically just exported it, right? You've sent billionaires to Texas or Florida. And when the billionaires leave, the innovation economy and the jobs that it creates are going to leave with them, making it worse for everybody else. So I think that then challenges the idea that this would actually reduce inequality, because you're also making all people who would be employed by the billionaires worse off, and not just by the current billionaires, but by others who might be think they might be a billionaire someday and worry that this experiment might be repeated again, right? I mean, there are people out there who are encouraging those who have just raised a Series B to get out of California. People on the Forbes list who are doing that. So it's about future billionaires as well. So third, okay, the state has a spending crisis, not a revenue crisis. For years, the California Department of Finance and the LAO have warned about structural deficits, persistent structural deficits. The LAO is it's like the Congressional Budget Office of the state of California. And this is not a revenue problem. Since 2019, revenues in California are up by, anybody want to guess about how much? They're up by 55%. Okay, but unfortunately, or for what it's worth, spending is up by 68%. So it's hard to look at that and say, California faces a major revenue problem. And as a result of these trends right now, California faces, and these are the LAO's numbers, a $93 billion structural deficit over the next 4 years, $93 billion, having nothing to do with OB3 or the federal government or Donald Trump or anything. Furthermore, according to the LAO, federal Medicaid changes from OB3 only increased Medi-Cal costs by $3 billion, not by $19 billion. And since this tax is earmarked to a special fund, the state will still have the $93 billion structural deficit, even if the wealth tax passes and manages to collect a few $billion. So this tax is not a solution to California's financial problems. So just one final point, this tax is billed as one time, but why would anybody believe that it's a one-time tax? I mean, the measure has to write its wealth tax authorization into the California Constitution, and it's written in a way that's specific to this measure. But once that infrastructure is in place, future wealth taxes can be built on top of it, on top of this infrastructure, at any rate, at any threshold, and at any time. And I think the important point is that billionaires understand this. That's why they're leaving. And it's why prospective future billionaires are likely looking elsewhere to start their businesses. So I think it's a classic case of killing the goose that lays the golden eggs, to use a trite phrase. But in sum, the tax is raising much less than advertised. It's doing nothing to address inequality. It creates permanent constitutional infrastructure for more of this, and it's driving out taxpayers that the state's government and that its whole economy really depends on.
So Mario, I want to see all right, who's got the room? I want to see if you could respond particularly to the first point. Like, has the tax, just by being proposed, already driven the kind of migration and future revenue loss that you presumably don't want for the state? Like yeah.
Yes. So let me address that. Billionaires, many of them, obviously they are upset by the proposal. So they've bought, real estate in Florida and other places. They've opened offices for their businesses. Have they moved yet? We don't know. I doubt they would have been able to move, before January 1st. We can debate it. But even after, it is true that you've read in the press, other billionaires are buying real estate and so on. So my guess is they will be looking at what happens. Is this ballot initiative going to get the signatures? What is the vote outcome going to be? And there's no really rush to move, because if it passes, they have to pay, if they haven't moved before January 1st over 5 years. So the thinking is that this 5-year experiment is going to determine, is it a success like I believe, or is it a disaster like Josh is saying? We'll see, and that's going to condition whether, this tax is going to be a one-time experiment or it's going to be permanent. If it's deemed, to be a successful fundraiser. And that brings me to one critique of Josh's remark. Namely, Josh says, the tax is not going to raise revenue because he assumes, the one-time tax revenue from the tax, but a reduction in income tax revenue in perpetuity. But that reduction in perpetuity really happens if billionaires really feel, okay, California is the place that does, wealth taxes on billionaires. But if it does, then there will be more wealth tax revenue coming in. So I don't want to be too technical, as a public finance economist, but let me put it this way. The income tax of California that they pay, on average, and with that, we more or less agree with Josh, is about 0.2% of their wealth per year. Okay? Now, if you tell them you're not going to pay 0.2% because we add this 1% tax, you say you're going to pay 1.2% total, 6 times more than what you are currently paying. So if those who stay pay 6 times more, you can actually lose, 80% of your tax base and still come out ahead on revenue. So that's why, to me, it doesn't make sense to say, that putting a wealth tax is going to lose revenue. You'd literally have to have a situation where virtually all the billionaires have left. And it's not realistic to me. Why? Because this is the place where the gold rush, the AI gold rush, the incredible wealth increases. In no other place in the US can you build, fortunes so quickly. The 1% thing is just very small relative to those numbers.
I want to sort of take, yeah.
I'd like to respond to that. First of all, it is interesting that this proposal, the proponents have heavily insisted that this is a one-time tax. Although in Emmanuel's remarks just now, it sounded like he was definitely admitting the possibility that it could turn into something more. So it is a bit of a shift in tone, at least relative to what I've read about the proposal and what the proponents are saying. But let me take Emmanuel's specific example, because I think it's actually very illustrative, right? So suppose that billionaires are only paying 0.2% of their income,
of their wealth,
of their wealth in income taxes each year. I actually think in 2023 it was 0.2%. In 2021 it was more like 0.4%. But let's take his 0.2% number. So what he's saying is essentially, even if 80% of the billionaires left as a result of this, the state would still be taxing 20% of the billionaire wealth each year. And so they'd basically be, indifferent or a little bit better off because they would still be getting the income tax from the billionaires. So essentially what he's saying is the state would then gain, say, $5 or $6 billion per year from the billionaires who had stayed, but they would lose, maybe $4 billion per year from the billionaires in the income of the billionaires who had left. So for $2 billion a year, they would be better off Just let that sink in, okay? Emmanuel would liquidate Silicon Valley for an extra $2 billion per year. I mean, this is classic not showing or considering what the economic damage would be of liquidating Silicon Valley. You want to have 80% of the billionaires leave in exchange for $2 billion per year of additional revenue. Maybe you don't have it at the top of mind, but California's annual budget is $325 billion per year. We have a $93 billion hole over the next 4 years. And we're going to liquidate Silicon Valley and say for an extra $2 billion a year, it's worth it to send all of those jobs and economic activity potentially away. I think it's a bad calculation, and I sometimes caricature the work in public finance as focusing very much on revenues at the expense of considering economic well-being and prosperity. And proponents of measures like this, they would be happy if the state brings in an extra $1 million per year, even if it destroys 50,000 jobs. I have a different calculation.
I guess my question on that, though, is like, how do you, two questions. One is like, doesn't it land you in a sort of reductive place where it's like, well, the billionaires are very mobile, they'll just leave if we tax them, and they're really important, so we have to like throw our hands up and we can't like tax them more. And then second, sort of how, to Emmanuel's point, how immobile are sort of California's wealth generation activities, the things, Silicon Valley here, the entertainment industry in Southern California, like, is that really at risk, or is it so ingrained with the entire sort of ecosystem here that it's that even if billionaires change their residence, that the activity still happens here?
Well, some of the activity might still happen here in the near term. I think that's true, but I think it's not going to be the case that Mark Zuckerberg is going to live in Florida for the rest of his life and he's just going to leave all of his economic activity here, because of course California is also taxing his businesses at a much higher rate than they would be taxed if they were in another state or the state that he's living in, right around the corner from him. So I think near term, sure, that might provide a little bit of buffer, but over the medium to long term, I wouldn't think that we're immune. There are other places that have nice weather, maybe not quite as nice as here, but and agglomerations can fall apart.
And then on the, should billionaires pay more somehow? Is there some way to tax them, or do you just kind of have to acknowledge that their mobility from state to state, right? Like, there's federal wealth tax proposals have they're constitutional problems, but not migration problems, because it's much harder to give up citizenship than it is to move location. But is that mobility just mean that part of the tax base is just harder to get at?
Well, I think some of the kind of examples people bring up are the sort of what is it, borrow, buy, and die strategies, right? Where basis is stepped up at death. I mean, the Simpson-Bowles bipartisan commission at the federal government level suggested maybe changing the way that the treatment of asset valuations is done at death, and that might be something that could be economically enhanced. Although all these discussions ignore the fact that billionaires, to the extent that they're owning assets, they're owning shares in companies, those companies are paying corporate taxes. I mean, it's double taxation, right? So I guess my feeling would just be, I mean, it's nice that we're here thinking about how can we squeeze more money out of billionaires, but what are the real problems? What are the real problems that the state of California actually faces? The real problems the state of California faces are that we are threatened by the possibility of reduced economic dynamism. And with measures like this, we're going to be sending jobs and innovation elsewhere. And so, given the mobility, I think, at least under the policy proposal that we're discussing, we're simply going to be exporting our billionaires and the jobs and innovation that they've done, and that the next generation that are starting companies will be doing to other places.
Mario, I want to come back to the corporate tax that Josh mentioned, because in some of your research, you've noted that that's actually, and we talked about this last year, that the corporate tax is basically the tax that billionaires pay because it's collected from the corporations where they're large shareholders. Why is that not maybe you want to do both, but why is that not a preferable way to raise money from billionaires?
Yeah, so the corporate tax, it's true, it's the main tax billionaires pay, on the profits corresponding to their shares in the businesses, but the actual tax rate is about 16% when you include all corporate taxes, federal, state, and foreign. And why? Because corporate taxes have just been reduced dramatically over decades. The US did it actually during the first Trump administration. The rate went from 35 to 21%. So it's a tax at source that's no longer very big. And indeed, 17%, that's less than what we wage earners typically pay, when you sum up the social security taxes, the income taxes, and so on. And then it's the main tax, because after that, billionaires are going to pay more only if there are dividend distributions, which typically are low for those tech companies, or if they realized capital gains, by selling their shares. And that's also low, at least relative, to the enormous gains they've been making. So what I'm saying is that, and to respond to Josh, is can we, what vision of the world do we have? Really, that's the tension here. Is everything coming, from just a few talented people, and if you start hitting or asking, those people to contribute more, it's a disaster for the economy? Or is it more, the type of infrastructure that the community, the state here is able to offer? When I read the long history, the way I see it, particularly in the United States, is that through the development of progressive taxation, more funds coming, from the rich, and investing, those funds into research, in particular, at the federal government, drove an enormous boom in economic growth, in the middle of the 20th century. So we do have examples of societies, successfully, asking the rich to contribute more, while actually, if anything, promoting economic growth. This California billionaire proposal, in my view, goes along that line. We have a problem again of extreme inequality. It is a first step in the sense that it just asks, some more taxes so that we can preserve, the health infrastructure that's certainly, central for any rich economy.
All right. Yeah, just respond and then we'll start thinking of questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're telling me that we have a revenue problem in the state of California when Governor Newsom's budget proudly proclaims that we spend $27,400 per pupil in California on K-12 education here. I think many people are unhappy with the public education system in California. Is that the problem? You're telling me we have a revenue problem when California spends $13,000 per Medicaid recipient. I just think I'm just having trouble seeing the revenue problem here. And in addition, to the extent that we have seen pre-tax, pre-transfer inequality increase in the United States, I think we have to focus also on the fact that, what are the incentives for people in the middle? In some cases, the marginal tax rate, when you include all of the phase-outs of public programs like Medicaid, SNAP, and so on, these can reach 100%. And so it's not surprising that we have reduced economic mobility, reduced dynamism there. People don't have the incentives to when you have all of these benefit cliffs. I feel like we're focusing very much on the idea that there are some people who have amassed a great amount of wealth, and how can we milk more of that wealth out of them? I know the topic of our discussion here has not been the national wealth tax, although Bernie Sanders has proposed a national wealth tax, also using a sort of similar 10% evasion avoidance parameter to what Emmanuel did in his initial calculations of the California Tax Act. But you can confiscate all the wealth of billionaires in the United States, and how much you get? You get about $8 trillion. You know how much the federal government spends every year? About $7 trillion. So you've confiscated all the wealth of billionaires. You paid for 1 year of federal government spending, and then what are you going to do?
All right, let's take some audience questions. I see one at the table right in the middle there. Just wait for the microphone to come to you. Right there. Yep. Behind you there. And then we'll come here.
So first of all, I'd like to thank Josh and Emmanuel for being here at SIEPR. Thank you. Great comments. So there's a question for both of you. Have Josh modeled out, and same with Emmanuel, the unintended secondary consequences, if this wealth tax passes, of a much larger cohort of people who, maybe are worth 100 or 150 million, and then down to 50 million, and then, say, this billionaire tax passed, well, next they're coming after me with 100 million.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the group, that really underpays relative to gains is really the very, very top, the billionaire class. In contrast, the millionaires, or at least the income millionaires, they pay relatively high taxes, because for them, the income tax works pretty well. So that's why my sense is that I'd be surprised, that we would go that route. Also because when you go down, the wealth ladder, you start hitting people, who may have liquidity issues, and this is the experience, of the European wealth taxes that typically hit millionaires, and they generated, a lot of backlash, while at the same time, they were not good at hitting the billionaires because they had exemptions. Typically, business wealth was excluded from the base. So I want you to think about this billionaire tax as something, that's exactly the reverse, that really goes after the main source of wealth for billionaires. That's the group that has had the biggest increases. That's the group that underpays. So yeah, that's my view.
The premise that billionaires pay low tax rates is highly debated and is not accepted. And part of the reason for that is the way that Emmanuel does his calculations when he says billionaires pay a 24% tax rate is that he's including unrealized capital gains in the denominator, and he's also apportioning corporate income in the denominator. And that's a double counting. And so David Splinter at the Joint Committee on Taxation of the United States Congress has done a number of calculations where he tries to correct for those, as well as some other debatable treatment of state income taxes and proper accounting for government transfers. So I don't think that the premise that billionaires pay a low tax rate is accepted. I think that's a very, very wide-ranging debate. Emmanuel's numbers would be that billionaires pay a 24% tax rate, and the rest of us poor souls pay a 30% tax rate. But if you look at the JCT's numbers, as a federal government agency, it's billionaires 38%, everybody else 25%.
We have one here.
Thank you both for coming today. Emmanuel, my question's for you. In 2004, California passed a 1% tax on people making greater than $1 million of income to fund mental health in the state of California. California has the worst mental health problem in the country. In 2012, California passed a 3% tax on millionaires and to fund teachers and California Teachers Association. Many people left. You get Dr. Karp from Palantir, who left California, and he took the largest employer in downtown Palo Alto, Palantir, with him when relocated to Denver. Ellison left and took Oracle with him. Elon left and took Tesla and SpaceX with him. When you look at the golden goose, which I agree left the state of California, but you've also lost all that compensation, RSU, option income that is relocated to different states. So it goes well beyond the golden goose. All those people did, in fact, leave. So can you agree we have a spending problem in California?
I mean, what I would say is that California has the most progressive tax system relative to other states. Exactly as you were saying, the income tax on millionaires is at the top 13.3, so it's high. And yet, California still, generates millionaires. It has a higher share of millionaires, relative to its population than other states. It's even more extreme, for the billionaire class. We have 27% of all billionaire wealth. We are 11, 12% of the population. So there might be some people leaving, Elon Musk, perhaps he left in part because he didn't want to pay, huge taxes, California taxes, on the big stock option exercises, he was going to go. But I think for dynamism, it's more important, to remain, an engine of growth and have an infrastructure, thanks, to this university here, have talent, system. They are going to develop businesses. And if some of them, after they become billionaires, they think, it's too much to ask me, to pay that extra billionaire tax, and they leave, so be it,
Other questions? I almost want to end on that, but we won't. I see one back there. Just wait for the microphone to get to you.
So I talked to Josh Becker, who's a senator here from this district, state of California. He said that the revenue from this entire tax would just go to healthcare. It doesn't go to teaching, education, food, housing, or anything, just healthcare. Are you aware of that?
Yeah, it's special fund.
It goes 90% healthcare, 10% food and education.
What else? Yes. And then out off in the up against the wall, the back of the room.
I just wanted to make sure I understood one point you made. I think the rough math was this 5-to-1 ratio, and so even if you lose 80%, you're kind of even or slightly better off. But if the tax is a one-time tax, then on a present value basis, after you get past the 5-year mark, isn't the math wildly negative? I think there's a little bit of a misstatement there about the duration.
Yes.
Well, that's how we treated it. We put out a paper just the other day called the net present value of the California wealth tax, and that's actually how we treated it, right? We basically started with the 100 billion that was Emmanuel's number. We discovered that these various people had left, Ellison and the 6 other billionaires, and started with that as the wealth tax base, made some other assumptions to get what we thought would be the wealth tax take, realistic wealth tax take of 40 billion, and then we took a net present value of all of the lost income under some different sensitivity assumptions about discount rates and things like that. So I think conceptually I would agree with you. And while I'm talking, I'll just say one other thing. There's a reason why 9 of the 12 OECD countries that had wealth taxes in 1990 have abandoned them, and that's because they're not good for the economy. They do not raise a lot of revenue. They're extremely expensive to administer. And I think Emmanuel's proposal is aimed to try to address a lot of the weaknesses of wealth taxes and say, okay, here we have an experiment with something new that's going to work. I don't think it's working.
Do you want to respond with the net present value?
Yeah, the net present value. It's true the numbers of Josh look so negative because you only raise revenue one time with the wealth tax. But he assumes the behavioral response, lasts forever. Generally, in public finance, if you think the behavioral response lasts forever, it's because there is a tax, that people don't want to pay. So if you have an annual tax, the numbers would look very different. And I'm not saying, 1% tax is going to make, 80% of billionaires leave. That's a crazy high behavioral response. But what I wanted to illustrate is that even with crazy high behavioral responses, you get ahead, in terms of revenue. So that's why I see Josh's numbers as way out of what would be, a reasonable scoring.
All right, we have time for one last question. Let's do right in the front here. This is the last thing between us and lunch, so be mindful of that.
I just wanted to do a +1 regarding the core problem, the underlying problem, which is how we're spending money in California. So our annual budget is $330 billion. That's how much we're spending. And Florida is spending $116 billion. We have 1.7 times their population. We're spending about 3 times the amount of money. And we have a $93 billion hole. They balance their budget every year. So we should be asking ourselves, why is it that they can do that and why we cannot?
We'll let Emmanuel first and then we'll let Josh close. So you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, states have budget balance requirements, so they have to meet, you know, their expenses and taxes every year. So then it's a question of what type of society do you want to live in. You know, Florida, they never did the Medicaid expansion. As a result, they still have, you know, a large fraction of their population uninsured. Healthcare is expensive. You know, the federal government mostly paid for it, you know, for the Medicaid expansion. That's a threat. If you are happy, you know, having a lot of people, you know, uninsured, yes, the Florida model. We are, yes, California is losing people, but actually, you know, before, you know, this billionaire tax debate, the people who were losing were not the billionaires, were the people, you know, at the lower income end who can't afford, you know, living in California.
All
Josh,
states,
you want to close?
all states do have, except for one, have some kind of balanced budget requirement, but those have differential degrees of how binding they can be. I mean, this is proven by the fact that there are $3.5 trillion of municipal bonds outstanding and you know, trillions of dollars of unfunded pension liabilities. And I think it has to do with budgetary structures and accountability. You know, when California legislature has been flooded with money, and when legislators get that money, you know, often they find new ways to spend it. California's been particularly good at starting programs that they say are temporary programs that then become permanent programs. And so I think that is why, you know, we've seen our budget grow very, very dramatically, and it's why we haven't seen that in other parts of the country where there's more budgetary discipline. I just want to say on education, I just don't think we can say that the problem is that we need more money for education. You have, you know, some other states that are now doing much better than California. Ranks very poorly in education and spends all, you know, probably per pupil, you know, in the top 5. So I think it's a problem of accountability.
Well, great. I'm glad we got everyone to agree on everything. Thank you. Thank Josh and thank you, Emmanuel.